Hi, this is Paul. The Synod of the Christian Reformed Church begins this coming Friday. Today is Tuesday the 6th, so that would be the 9th. Synod delegates check in. Right here, here's the agenda for Synod. If you want to see what it looks like in person, it's pretty fat. And so synodical delegates are all apportioned into advisory committees. That's where everyone really on the floor of everyone, all delegates to Synod in a sense, really get to say their piece on their advisory committee over sort of a slice of the Synod. And then the advisory committee reports all come to the floor of Synod, and that's how Synod conducts its business. Now, as many of you know from the videos that I've been putting out, the Christian Reformed Church is now going through its turn at dealing with same-sex marriage and everything that's going through that. As if you look back in my video history, you know that Synod 2022 made some pretty consequential decisions with respect to the status of same-sex marriage and Christian Reformed Church confessional system. Let me get see what next slide is. Yeah, in many ways, one of the things is I've been continuing to follow the conversation on CRC Voices, which is a listserv within the Christian Reformed Church where people who are interested in these issues can write and listen to each other and discuss it, not on Facebook where you have all of this longer form or this shorter form stuff, but CRC Voices actually helps people sort of put things together as a whole thing. One of the things that occurred to me the other day when one of the old-time members of the Christian Reformed Church, who is quite troubled by the events that have happened, really made me think about sort of the 4 P's of knowing the Christian Reformed Church, or 2 different Christian Reformed churches. There's sort of the propositional confessional church that is defined by its confessions. The Christian Reformed Church has 3 creeds and 3 confessions. And there are various levels of participation in the Christian Reformed Church. Attenders, there's no confessional requirement at all to attend Christian Reformed worship services or to participate in Christian Reformed churches at various levels. If you want to be an actual member of the Christian Reformed Church, you make promises standing up as an adult member. That's sometimes done through adult confession of faith. And some of the things that you promise is that the teachings of your church believe are in concordance with the Word of God, with the Bible, and that you'll submit to the authority and the discipline of the church. A third level of participation would be office bearers, and office bearers are required to sign the covenant of office bearers, which includes the creeds and confessions of the church. One thing which is different from previous synods is that almost always that's sort of a pro forma thing that happens early on. This year, it might be different. There are some classes of the Christian Reformed Church that have suspended requiring people to sign the covenant of office bearers because Synod 2022 made the traditional view of marriage a confessional issue. And that's really what the big fight this year is going to be about. And so some people, for conscience sake, have not signed the covenant of office bearers or might be unwilling to stand for it at Synod. Then the question is, well, would they be seated? The normal answer would be no, because in order to be seated at Synod as a delegate, you have to sign the covenant of office bearers. Now, there's other layers to this that I've spoken of in past videos. A gravamen process by which you have, let's say, that's a big, huge conversation that we might get into over this next couple of weeks as the materials start to come out. So, generally speaking, you can find previous sessions of Synod in the Christian Reformed Church YouTube section where you can find past Synod things. Usually this is a normal thing. Synod is convened by a hosting congregation. This year, the hosting congregation is Church of the Servant in Classis, Grand Rapids East. Generally speaking, often a pastor of that church will greet the delegates and then we'll ask them to all arise, and by arising, they signify their subscription to the 3 creeds and 3 confessions of the Christian Reformed Church. And once they do that, then Synod will elect its officers. Now, again, this whole question of subscription is central to this coming synod. And so very early on, that Friday morning session might be different. You can watch the sessions of the Christian Reformed Church on YouTube. There's a 20-minute delay so that people can't sort of text things into delegates, and so that people on the floor, the people that are delegated to synod, are the ones determining what comes out of their mouth. Over the last few years, with electronic communication and social media, Synod has added some new requirements that puts buffers on this kind of thing. So the Synod proceedings are almost live. There's a 20-minute delay. Friday morning, all of this will begin. There's opening worship and the convening session of Synod. And then at 11:15 that first day, they then go into their advisory committees. But as the proposed schedule says, these things might change. Then Synod is very quiet. The advisory committees begin Friday and meet all day Saturday. And, well, let's see. If you're interested, you can download the agenda for Synod. It's a PDF. It's free to anyone who gets the link, and I'll put the link to the Synod webpage below. So Saturday, there are advisory committees. Sunday, there's worship in local CRC churches. Then there's a synodical worship service in the evening. And there are various workshops that happen Sunday night. And then Monday morning, the full plenary session starts. Now, ideally, most of the advisory committees will be will have most of their work finished. There's usually a few things that have to be ironed out, but then the plenary sessions start. The advisory committees that are dealing with the hot topics this year will likely meet into the week. And that, those who are delegated to those committees, that's going to be tough, but we probably won't see their reports until Wednesday or Thursday. Synod is supposed to end by 3 p.m. on Thursday. It used to be that Synod had 2 full weeks of time to do these things. Now it barely gets a week. And so we will see what comes out of this Synod, and I intend to follow it on this channel quite closely. Last year I was a delegate at Synod, and last year they instituted a social media gag order on all of the delegates, and so I couldn't do this, so I had to wait to give my reports after Synod. This year, because I'm not a delegate, I can give reports during Synod and offer just a little bit more context to what comes out. But this concept of there being 2 CRCs, there's sort of the propositional confessional CRC whose membership is determined by the confessionality, whether you ascend to all of those propositions in the confessions. And so that denomination is won by confession. But there's also sort of the other 3 Ps of the CRC, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. And a lot of the conflict sort of comes out of that. What is your identity as a member of the Christian Reformed Church? This has been something that's been happening in the denomination for a very long time. I remember there was a period of time when it was just about 6 or 8 months after I had come to this church. Some of the people who had been quite enthusiastic about my coming to this church suddenly, maybe perhaps upon closer look at what exactly they bought, decided they had made a bad decision. And there was an exodus from this church within the first year of me coming here. And that has a long story, which I'm not going to tell here. But one thing I noticed is that many of the people who left the local church, who had been raised in the Christian Reformed Church and grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, very much wanted to participate in the Christian Reformed Church, but they didn't want to participate in any of the Christian Reformed churches that were available to them in the city of Sacramento. At that point, there was a church plant up in Rockland, and there was our church here. And over the next few years, we would plant a few more churches. Most of the people who had left this Christian Reformed Church did not attend any of the other Christian Reformed churches. They had their own ideas about the kinds of music that they want, the kinds of sermons that they wanted, and they found those in other churches in Sacramento. But for many of them, if you talk to them, they'd say, I've always been Christian Reformed, even if I'm going to another church. There have been many people like this. Paul Schrader is, you probably might recognize his name from Hollywood. He grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. Peter Kreeft grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. Many times If you grow up within a particular church, even if you no longer attend that church, you feel yourself a part of that church because there are all of these customs and traditions. And the other three P's, you're very much part of the Christian Reformed Church, even though it could be that procedurally or propositionally you feel yourself out of line with the Christian Reformed Church. A big part of what's going on now really has all of that tension. Many people went to schools. The Christian Reformed Church had many day schools that people went to. The Christian Reformed Church had Calvin College. My grandfather went to Calvin College. Both of my parents went to Calvin College. Myself and my two sisters all went to Calvin College. I met my wife at Calvin College, although she didn't grow up in the Christian Reformed Church. My wife, because she didn't grow up in the Christian Reformed Church, had a very different experience with the Christian Reformed Church. That was sort of her husband's church. And that was her church in Grand Rapids because we were worshiping in the same church in Grand Rapids, and that was a Christian Reformed church, but she didn't have the same kind of formation in terms of her Christian Reformed identity that someone like I did who had been in the church multi-generationally. They've been to youth programs. They had young Calvinist conventions. You had all of these things that were church participation, cadets and Calvinettes. At the Quest for a Spiritual Home conference, the breakfast on Saturday was hosted by the church cadet group. And the cadets are sort of like a Boy Scout group. It's sort of a Christian Reformed Church knockoff of the Boy Scouts. You get your little uniform, you get your merit badges, you get your little rank on your sleeve. I sometimes joke that it's the Christian Reformed paramilitary group. But this is, for many people, what it means to be Christian Reformed. You grow up within this community. The Christian Reformed Church also has a lot of theology about covenant theology, and so you're baptized into the Christian Reformed Church. And it's expected that you become a teenager or a young adult. You'll make adult profession of faith in the Christian Reformed Church, and then you will be an adult member of the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church has never been tremendously effective in evangelizing people outside itself, but it devoted an enormous amount of its efforts to keeping its children. And so the Christian Reformed Church was a multi-generational denomination. A big part of the difficulties of the Christian Reformed Church have, like many churches, been the successive generations, really beginning with the counterculture. Successive generations leaving the church. But I will regularly hear from people who I went to Christian school with growing up. They've left the Christian Reformed Church. Some went to more conservative churches. Some went to more progressive churches. Some don't go to any church at all. But in this way, people identify with the Christian Reformed Church in two different ways. Now, as I mentioned before, the counterculture was a big deal in this. And a lot of this happened sort of around the civil rights movement. I've used this article before from Patheos, which I thought was an excellent article. It was entitled, How the Civil Rights Movement Converted White Liberal Protestants to Secularism. I thought it was a very good article. The church I grew up in, my father's church in Paterson, New Jersey, if you're curious about that church, there is a self-published memoir of sorts of my father that you can find on Amazon Kindle entitled Chains of Grace by Stan Vanderklay. And it tells the story it's very much a Christian Reformed story, a kid who grows up in parsonages dotted throughout the Midwest, then goes to Calvin College, Calvin Seminary, gets married, another girl from the Christian Reformed Church moves to Paterson, New Jersey, and then in many ways lives through the civil rights movement and all the various permutations in the 60s and 70s. The Northside Chapel, as it was called then, was very much a hybrid church. The majority of the people who participated in the church were African Americans from the community who had migrated up with what Isabel Wilkinson calls the Great Migration. And then there were some people from the surrounding Christian Reformed churches that during the 60s and 70s either had a missional heart, and they had actually been a part of sort of the old chapel that was doing like benevolence work among many of the poor people who had moved up in the middle of the 20th century to take those Paterson factory jobs. Many of the Dutchmen who had immigrated to New Jersey and worked in those factories as the generations emerged, began to move into other neighborhoods, get better houses, buy dairies or sell dairies, work in other ways. That's sort of the story of the New Jersey church. And of course, so a big part of what it meant to be at Northside Chapel in the 60s and 70s were many of the counterculture issues. And of course, that was sort of the way in which I grew up. And the Christian Reformed Church had its own struggles in the 60s and 70s with respect to racism. There was the Christian Reformed Church started a synodical committee on race relations. That was to help the Christian Reformed Church enfold African Americans and people who didn't have Dutch backgrounds. There was a fight over Christian school participation in many places because, as in my church, the Christian Reformed Church worked in a very covenantal way. If you were a member of the Christian Reformed Church, the expectation and encouragement was that you would send your kids to the Christian day schools. Many people didn't have the money to send their kids to what then was sort of a private education. The schools were very much a communal thing, and so then money would be raised within the church so that the children of the church could go to the Christian school. Now, of course, if your churches are beginning to enfold African Americans, Hispanic, non-Dutch whites in the community, they would start to go to the Christian school. And there's a lot of racial tension in the 60s and 70s. A lot of Dutch immigrants didn't have a lot of contact with African Americans. The Paterson, New Jersey area in many ways was rather ghettoized. Chicago was fairly ghettoized. And so race relations were a very big deal in the Christian Reformed Church in the 60s and 70s. And Synod did a lot of work on dealing with racism in the Christian Reformed Church. Now, sort of culminated in this is a banner cover from the banner November 3, 1980. And the title of this banner is probably the most famous banner in the history of the Christian Reformed Church. The banner was the denominational weekly magazine, and I've mentioned it before. I've read you some of my articles that my grandmother would write to it in Woman's World. The banner editor, in many ways in those days, was a very high status, very influential job. And the editor of the banner at that time was a man named Andrew Kuyvenhoven. It wasn't unusual in the 60s and 70s to run into Christian Reformed people that spoke with a Dutch brogue, with a Dutch accent, because there was a new wave of emigration from the Netherlands after the Second World War. Many of those immigrants went to Canada and California, but a few were in New Jersey. And so growing up, there were a few individuals in the church who would speak with a Dutch accent because they were Dutch immigrants. Andrew Kuyvenhoven was a Dutch immigrant, spoke with a Dutch accent. It's also true that the immigrants after the Second World War left a very different church in the Netherlands than the immigrants that left the Netherlands, let's say, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. The Netherlands changed a lot between the beginning of the 20th century and after the Second World War, and would continue to change after the emigration from the Netherlands after the Second World War. So he was a Dutch immigrant. He was the banner editor, and he wrote this article, "It's Time to Burn the Wooden Shoes." And this caused a tremendous amount of controversy. Many in the Christian Reformed Church, their identity was tied up in their Dutchness. Again, we talked about the confessional aspect of membership in the Christian Reformed Church, and then, let's say, the communal, familial, historical aspect. What Kuyvenhoven was saying, basically, as a response to a lot of the racial tensions that had happened in the 60s and 70s, it's time for the CRC to stop being a Dutch church and to start being the question is, a what? And there were already tensions within the Christian Reformed Church. Are we sort of a conservative evangelical church in the neo-evangelical line? Are we a deeply confessional Reformed church that reinforces Reformed distinctives? Are we a church that, and this is the language that emerged for a while, are we a church that speaks Christianity but with a Reformed accent, sort of like a lot of these Dutchmen came over and they spoke, their English was fine, great, this is a banner editor, but they had never lost that Dutch accent. Now, this is early on in terms of trying to grow the Christian Reformed Church beyond its Dutch borders, and in fact, after a while in the 80s and especially in the 90s, many in the Christian Reformed Church would then sort of hop on to the seeker movement and say, well, the Christian Reformed Church should learn from Bill Hybels, a son of the Christian Reformed Church who planted Willow Creek in suburban Chicago, and we should learn to grow beyond, because already during the baby boom, the Christian Reformed numbers rose dramatically, but after the baby boom, those numbers started to decline because Christian Reformed families started having fewer children. The Christian Reformed Church, up until the counterculture and through the 80s and into the 90s, had done a fairly good job of sort of keeping its kids within the Christian Reformed Church, but the minds and hearts of those children would change, and especially because of the counterculture and a number of things. I recently received a letter from a woman who went to the same high school I did. In fact, her brother played a musical instrument with me. I immediately recognized her name and her last name, and she told me about the fact that she had been a nurse during the AIDS crisis, and she couldn't stand the position that the Christian Reformed Church had taken towards gay and lesbian individuals, and so she left the Christian Reformed Church. Many people just would migrate to places that there weren't many Christian Reformed churches, and they would join other denominations, or they wouldn't go to any church at all. Now here's a membership chart of the Christian Reformed Church from 1963 to 2021. And you can see that it grew and grew and grew. And I remember my father was on the Home Missions Board. It was sometime in the 90s. I think I was in the Dominican Republic, or maybe before then. And I remember him coming back from a meeting and talked about the fact that the Christian Reformed Home Missions Board had decided to set a goal of reaching a membership of 400,000 people by 2000. Now, obviously, there were no more Dutchmen coming over. And in fact, when I moved to Sacramento, the neighbor behind me was a Dutch immigrant. And going to a Dutch Reformed church was the last thing he would ever want to do. He had grown up in a strict Dutch Reformed church in the Netherlands, and when he left the Netherlands and married an American woman, she had actually been in the Netherlands, so she spoke Dutch too, but they weren't at all into Christianity. They were living in Northern California, and they're very much into more New Age types of spirituality. And so there were no more members coming from the Netherlands. Christian Reformed people weren't having the numbers of children that they were having before. Christian Reformed youth were not staying in the church in the percentages that they had before. And so the Christian Reformed Church had a big push to try to really do much better in terms of evangelism in North America. There were a number of attempts to plant churches that were like seeker churches, hoping that they would grow like seeker churches. A few of them succeeded. During this time, though, there was a significant influx of Koreans, which helped the Christian Reformed numbers. But as you can see, the Christian Reformed Church reached its peak in the early 1990s. Also significant in this is the fact that there was a significant split in the 1990s. Maybe 60,000 people left the Christian Reformed Church over the decision to include women in ecclesiastical office in the Christian Reformed Church. And since that time, the numbers have been declining. And as you can see, by 2021, numbers were around 210,000 membership. And as you might imagine, membership was getting older as well. I thought it might be interesting to look at this banner editorial. Now, you can see this is 43 years ago. But the issues are still around us. Our lives are very short. These kinds of things move much more slowly. So this was written in 1980. When you transplant a tree, you must make sure that you carry a big clump of dirt with its roots from the old location to the new one. The older the tree, the bigger amount of dirt that has to go with the tree to the new place. The same truth holds for immigrants. When they come from the Netherlands to Canada or from Korea to the United States, they need some of the old soil around them. Otherwise, they will wither and die. I've seen a few immigrants who tried to be Canadian 2 weeks after arriving at the Toronto airport. Soon, they were nobodies. Immigration is a process. For healthy development, immigrants must retain some of the old ways while learning the new. Older people need more of the old soil than younger ones, and some trees are actually too old to be transplanted. Christians who move from one country to another experience a special comfort and a peculiar temptation when they form a congregation in their new country. There's nothing more comforting for a Korean or a Dutch Christian than to be able to hear the Word of God in his or her own language, to sing in the familiar tongues, to exercise Christian fellowship in an atmosphere that is reminiscent of the good old days. For immigrants, the church does not merely proclaim the only comfort, the church itself is a haven of comfort. And here is that peculiar temptation. The church becomes a Dutch, Korean, German home away from home. By one's speech and surname, one is recognized as a son or a daughter who is at home in his church. The group does not deny that the gospel must be sung in many songs and that God calls all people from every nation, but our church is for our people. Now, again, it's really important to recognize that this comes on the heels of a fair amount of conflict and tension over race relations in the Christian Reformed Church. And again, I also want you to keep in mind sort of the Christian Reformed Church as confessional community and the Christian Reformed Church as heritage, organic community. This would be perfectly innocent if it concerned the formation and continuation of a social club, but ethnic exclusivism becomes sinful when it concerns the Church of Jesus Christ. The members of this church acquire a warped sense of values. They kept together by a hunger for Holland or a craving for Korea, and they have no appetite for Pentecost. This is a touchy subject. Indeed, it proved to be. If two people look at old customs and manners, the one will say rich and beautiful, and the other will cry sinful and idolatrous. There are towns in Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa where old pioneers are praised who to their dying day maintain that on Sunday only Dutch should be spoken. It was actually the First World War that began to change that because people around couldn't distinguish Dutch from German. Even if you look at Pennsylvania Dutch, they're not actually Dutch, they're German because Dutch and Deutsch sound a lot alike. So it was actually during the First World War that a lot of immigrants, a lot of churches began including English in their services. A lot of churches also festooned themselves in flags just so that their neighbors who were really angry with the Germans wouldn't confuse them for German. And when my grandfather took a church in Owen Sound, Ontario, he conducted services in Dutch. When my father went to Calvin Seminary in 1958, Dutch was a language prerequisite for entrance into Calvin Seminary. That had been dropped by the time I went to seminary, as, in fact, Latin had been dropped just before I went to seminary, which I kind of regret. It would have been good to have learned some Latin. Back to the article. By contrast, there are cities in Canada where the changes to the new climate were so fast that older trees have a hard time surviving. However, we have no time to indulge. We cannot afford the luxury of indulging in big squabbles about little things. The one big question for those who should read the banner is, how must we live as God's people on the place and in the time God has appointed for us? Now remember, this is a Dutch immigrant writing, and in 1980, there were a good number of Dutch immigrants. You always know someone who has a deep immigrant mindset when they would call the people who lived around them Americans or Canadians. In other words, it's them, not us. I am sorry if we hurt anyone by burning these wooden shoes on, continue to the next page, on the cover. You may also shellac them or bring them to Heritage Hall. That's a room at Calvin University. Certainly, you should never apologize for your birth or your brogue. That's the Dutch accent. Neither is it God's law that you must hate your grandpa when you love the Lord. The point is that you and I, as members of the Church of Jesus, must think deeply on God's will for this hour. The Changing Tide, November 1980. Although the leadership of the Christian Reformed Church still has a strong ethnic Dutch coloring, or a little pale lack of coloring, perhaps, there are still many congregations where the old Dutch influence is powerfully present. It is no longer true that the Christian Reformed Church is an ethnic church. Two factors are now contributing to the change. First, there is the influx of the non-Dutch. In the year 1979, no less than 7,000 members were received by transfer from other denominations and through evangelism. That's quite a number. The only reason why the church didn't grow proportionately is the sad exodus of another 4,000. Newcomers are scattered over hundreds of congregations. Each brings his or her own history and adds to the variety of the whole. The church will experience the most lasting changes from the addition of blocks of other ethnic groups, especially Koreans and Chinese. I'm somewhat acquainted with our Korean members. They are very ambitious and zealous for the honor of God. Their youth are studious, and there are many PhD candidates among them. Quite a few have a considerable amount of worldly goods already. And these sort of contrasting that from the Dutch that came from the Netherlands after the Second World War often came only with the clothes on their back. They didn't have much. In these respects, they fit in well with the Christian Reformed old-timers, but we had better pray for each other that all of us may walk humbly with the Lord and seek his kingdom first. Another factor, a negative one that contributes to the change of the church, is the virtual disappearance of Dutch theological influence. When I was a student at Calvin Theological Seminary in the 1950s, the best books on any subject were always the Dutch books. We who could read Dutch were a mile ahead of the ordinary American boy who had to somehow try to learn Dutch and then had to read Bavinck and Kuyper and all of those folks in Dutch. My grandmother, as she was paring down their living arrangements, first from a condo and then to 2 rooms at Raybrook. Again, it's also called the Holland Home, still called that in many places in the Christian Reformed Church, including northern New Jersey. She kept paring down his libraries. The last 2 books he would basically not allow her to get rid of were Kuyper's Systematic Theology and Bavinck's Systematic Theology. And when I would visit them as a college student and walk across the road from Calvin College to Raybrook Manor to the Holland Home, he would often be sitting in his chair with a dress shirt and a tie, every day a tie, because he said, Grace says she likes me in a tie. He'd be sitting there reading in Dutch. We were made to believe that we would make better preachers and certainly better theologians because we could read Dutch. Later, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary where similar beliefs were held with respect to the German language. This attitude had been radically altered. Of course, there are Dutch classics, just as there are French and German theologians of lasting significance, but the prejudice towards Dutch professors had disappeared. This change made for a quick independence of the Canadian part of our church. In 25 years, Reformed theology and practice has changed so much in the Netherlands that Canadian Christian Reformed Church people don't recognize the rock from whence they were hewn. Therefore, they look for a more independent expression of the Reformed faith and life on this continent. And if they read Christian literature at all, they are sooner inclined to reach for American evangelical author than the latest book of the Dutch professor. To their own surprise, they have a close affinity to the former than the latter. The necessity of change. The Dutch Americans have been much more American than Dutch for many years, and that's true. My great-grandfather emigrated from the Netherlands in the 1890s. On my mother's side, my great-grandparents emigrated just at the beginning of the 20th century. They were Frisians, and they went to Whitensville, Massachusetts. There are whole tribes of people in Michigan who call themselves Hollanders, but they are as American as hamburger and apple pie. I must respectfully differ with the scholarly analysis among us who have defined the minds of the Christian Reformed Church according to models derived from Dutch history. I do not deny that there are streams of pietism, Kuyperianism, and doctrinalism that can be found here and in the old country, but the influence of American Presbyterianism and evangelicalism has been understated. David Snapper, who's on CRC Voices, when he was doing his THM at Calvin Seminary, read through years of banner editorials. I should pull up these. David does a nice outline of some of the concerns of the banner editorials. But before the Second World War, a lot of the banner editorials were deeply concerned with the influence of Methodism. Of course, the Catholics were bad because they were papists, but the Methodism and American evangelicalism was a deep threat, and they wanted to sort of cluster around other like-minded Reformed people, but yet sort of stay distinct. By the 1980s, there were deep commonalities after the Second World War. individuals left the war and very much sought to have an impact in the nation. If you want to read a really good article on history of the Christian Reformed Church and some of these things, Robert P. Swearinga has some really good things online. He was writing about the departures in the 1990s from the Christian Reformed Church and basically said that their roots had been before. The thesis of this paper is that the seeds of secession in the Christian Reformed Church were planted at least 50 years ago. After the Second World War, this largely immigrant church experienced a generational change, both at the top, in the pulpits, denominational schools, Calvin College and Theological Seminary, and at the bottom in the pews. The immediate cause was the return of military personnel. Thousands of second and third generation Hollanders served within the American military forces in the far corners of the world, and more than 20 ministers in the Christian Reformed Church served as chaplains. The military experience changed many, and on their return, they called for the church to open up to the American scene and become more culturally diverse and contemporary. Now remember, these are people who were, for the most part, the sons and grandsons of immigrants who fought the Second World War, came back and made those noises. This is Andrew Kuyvenhoven, or the previous article is Andrew Kuyvenhoven writing in the 1980s. We ought to abhor a narrow isolationism as the very plague of death to our church, declared George Staub. Our people were afraid of America, afraid of the corrupting influences that might weaken our Reformed character and rob us of our heritage. It was time, added Harry Bohr. That's Harry Bohr is the guy that wrote this book that I talked about that has a lot to do with subscription in the Christian Reformed Church. It was time, added Harry Bohr, to leave our Dutchness behind. Remember, this is in the 1950s, so this is 30 years before Kuyvenhoven's article. And these are, again, people who had fought shoulder to shoulder with non-CRC people in the American military. It was time, added Harry Bohr, to leave our Dutchness behind and become a truly American church by reaching out to all races and people. Chaplain like Staubs and Bohr, and indeed all the servicemen as well, were introduced to mainline American Christianity and cultural diversity in military chapels, as were the new breed of campus chaplains who the Christian Reformed, the CRC Home Missions Board began placing on college and university campuses in 1941. Leonard Verdine at the University of Michigan was the first of these men. The war experience of some leaders thus dealt a blow to the church's ethnic and doctrinal isolation and weakened its homogeneity. In fact, in 1946, the number of Christian Reformed members transferring to other denominations increased by 40% and continued to climb until 1951. In other words, there was sort of a non-split, there was sort of a leak. A surprising number of 10,000 members transferred out of the Christian Reformed Church during the decade of the 1940s, mostly after 1945. The losers were particularly heavy in Grand Rapids, Holland, and Chicago, most likely joining mainline churches or perhaps the RCA. These were individuals that were frustrated by the provincial, the Dutchness, the Christian Reformed Church felt small and isolated, and they wanted to go out into the bigger world, and so that was a leak left. Some veterans enrolled, courtesy of the GI Bill, in Calvin College and Seminary, the denominational school, and pushed their ideas that the Christian Reformed Church should move out of its status as a sheltered enclave and become more open to new ideas and attitudes. Chaplains who entered the parish ministry and took up teaching posts at Calvin College and Seminary echoed the same themes. I'll make that print larger for those of you who are trying to read on the page. Chaplains who entered parish ministry and took up teaching posts at Calvin College and Seminary echoed the same themes. Many other vets, such as former chaplain Henry Van Til, arrived on campus with equally strong opposing convictions, believing that in the world's turmoil and upheaval, the Christian Reformed Church should hold fast to its principles and that any dilution of them would be perilous. This polarity in thinking caused some tensions on campus. So recalled Edward Harima, one of these students who stood firmly on the stand pat side. But the movers and shakers on the faculty and in the Plato Club of philosophers had the best minds, and they gained the upper hand. Let's see if he has what his footnote is here. I just mentioned Harry Bohr. This is a book written by Henry Staub. Henry Staub had been my father's favorite professor And in fact, when he wrote this book, my father had him sign it. And Henry Staub at that point was living in Raybrook Manor. My father visited him, wrote him a nice little note. Dear Stan, thank you very much for your letter and the kind sentiments as expressed. Well, I guess my father wrote him a letter. This is dated 4th of August, 1995. I'm glad you liked the book and encouraged me to work on the sequel. Now, the sequel was never published to my knowledge. I have a manuscript of it that my father had received. I don't know if the family ever had it published. I wish you and yours every good thing and the Lord's beneficent present. As always, Henry Staub. Nice little note. Closed with the book. And the book has its blurbs on the back, such CRC luminaries as Lewis Smedes of Fuller Seminary and Cornelius Plantinga of Calvin Seminary, the younger brother to Alvin Plantinga, who some of you know who he is. You can just sense the familial way of this denomination if you're unfamiliar with it. The massive post-World War II immigration of Orthodox Calvinists to North America added a cultural dimension to these intergenerational tensions. The newcomers primarily settled in Canada because of the U.S. quota restrictions, but ministers called field agents effectively marshaled them into the fold. That's one of the things my grandfather did. Between 1950 and 1960, the Canadian membership of the Christian Reformed Church grew by nearly 50,000. The immigrants renewed a flagging ethno-religious identity among the second and third generation U.S. Reformed Dutch, although it was remarkably slow-lived. In contrast to the slow assimilation of the 19th century immigrants, the post-war immigrants moved into the mainstream in one generation. These post-war Netherlanders had been changed by the war experience even more than the Americans. In church assemblies, the Canadians in the last 15 years have moved into the driver's seat in both the conservative and progressive camps of the church. Banner editors were almost exclusively Canadians, and the current one still is. Students from north of the border had a major impact on the intellectual life of Calvin College and Seminary, reflecting the Afscheiding and Doliancy minds within the the GKN. I won't try offending my Dutch listeners by trying to speak Dutch. The Canadian wing of the Christian Reformed Church introduced neo-Calvinist political thought and the human-centered biblical hermeneutic of several theologians at the Free University of Amsterdam, the flagship school of the GKN. This body is rightfully considered the mother church of the Christian Reformed Church, and its influence remained strong for generations, until two denominations had a parting of the ways in the 1990s. Daughter separated from mother because mother had become too open to theological heterodoxy, as evidenced finally in their full accepting of practicing homosexuals. The GKN seemed to be deforming rather than reforming. The Canadian wing of the Christian Reformed Church, while generally open to change, was also strongly orthodox contingent that led the secession movement in the 1990s. In the year 1951 was a fateful one in the intellectual life of the Christian Reformed Church. Calvin President Henry Schultz announced his retirement and was succeeded by a young history professor and war veteran William Spoolhoff, who narrowly won over Henry Staub, the faculty's first choice. This set up a number of times when the faculty wanted one president and the board selected another. The faculty often wanted sort of their premier teacher to lead them, and the board wanted an executive who would fundraise, run the school, do management, etc. That same year, Professor Evan Runner, a graduate of Westminster Seminary and the Free University of the Netherlands, and a disciple of the Dutch philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd and Dirk Vollenhoven, began lecturing at Calvin in his bombastic style to a cadre of ardent Kuyperians, styled the Groen Club, who came to sit under him. Runner had met Calvin alumni Henry Staub and Henry Van Til at the Free University and the English Church in the Amsterdam, where all three Americans preached, and Staub was influential in bringing Runner to Calvin. Runner was just finishing up teaching when I went to Calvin, and a friend from my floor, in fact, came to Calvin to take Runner because it was so famous. I was just a know-nothing freshman, and looking back on it, I wish I had. That friend of mine in the dorms eventually followed Peter Kreeft into the Roman Catholic Church. He was a philosophy major too. Furthermore, H.J. Kuyper, the banner editor in 1951, launched an anti-communist crusade against speech professor Lester DeCoster for his supposedly socialist proclivities. More serious of all, Calvin College became embroiled in the Sacred Seven controversy, and the largely unrelated seminary situation came to a head. And then he goes into those particular controversies. And I'll put the link to this below, so if you want to read up on it, you can. So that's a little bit more context to Kuyvenhoven's Burn the Wooden Shoes. Back to Kuyvenhoven. I must respectfully differ with the scholarly analysis among us who have defined the minds of the Christian Reformed Church according to models derived from Dutch history. A lot of those conflicts in the Netherlands got brought over too. I do not deny that there are streams of pietism, Kuyperianism, and doctrinalism that have been found here, as in the old country, but the influence of American Presbyterianism and evangelicalism has been understated, especially in the isolated pockets of the church where people think their theology and culture are very Dutch. They are unlike anything the old country ever produced. Kuyvenhoven's point was right, that for many people, because their identity was still Christian Reformed so strongly in sort of that Vervaekian 3P way, they felt themselves Christian Reformed because that's what their people was. Increasingly, they were much more American, and they would have more in common with some of the Presbyterians. This would continue really up until the present day, where a lot of the energy in the Christian Reformed Church is really coming as a result of the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement and the work of John Piper or Tim Keller, let's say. It is not good to be an ethnic church. Wow. There's a bold statement by Kuyvenhoven, Dutch immigrant. All older churches in North America whose membership is ethnically determined are dead or dying, or at best they are sterile. Now, in the 1980s, and Kuyvenhoven's probably speaking more of Canada than the United States, you could find churches that were primarily made up of immigrants and stubborn immigrants. We have this little saying in the Christian Reformed Church, wooden shoes, wooden head, wouldn't listen. And so he's looking around and saying these churches are going to die. We need to get on with life, and the future of the Christian Reformed Church is Canada and America. The growing evangelical churches have many bad features. Again, there's a long distrust for evangelicalism in the Christian Reformed Church. They lack historic continuity with the apostolic tradition. They have no confessional concern. Therefore, they are able to express that other trait of the true church. All kinds of people find their oneness in Jesus Christ. In other words, he's saying we need to take from the evangelicals their capacity to do evangelism, and in that way, maybe the Christian Reformed Church will be able to undo its demographic problem. Kuyvenhoven would not, the Christian Reformed, this was 1980, which was here, the Christian Reformed Church would continue to grow again until 1992. The Mennonite Brethren also have formed an ethnic church, but it is neither dead nor sterile because it tackles its most basic challenge: how to make the transition to a fellowship of churches that can communicate their faith and full acceptance to a people of all ethnic backgrounds while remaining a Mennonite fellowship. Harold Jansen, the Christian Leader, August 12, 1980. Kuyvenhoven had probably read an article, got all jazzed, and so wrote this. He had no idea. Well, he probably had some idea of the storm that he would raise. Fear not, the next section says. Inevitably, the church is changing. Yes, it is. We must not only accept this fact, we must work for the renewal of the church. We can contribute to its upbuilding only if we are able to discern between the historical, accidental traits and the Reformed distinctiveness. There you see the language, Reformed distinctiveness. But if you're throwing away all the cultural things, what's the Reformed distinctiveness? So the assumption, I think, was, well, our Heidelberg Catechism was the most beloved of the three. Belgian Confession, yes. Canons of Dort, okay. But Heidelberg Catechism, every Christian Reformed Church kid was taught the Heidelberg Catechism. And that, of course, would. But how are these things connected with the Dutchness? 43 years ago, the sentiments were quite a bit different. The Dutch accent has little or nothing to do with Reformed distinctiveness. That was supposed to be what would hold us together. We must not be afraid when we are losing it, just as the Mennonites have forgotten that Menno Simons was Dutch, not German, and so we tend to forget that Calvin was French. The Reformed tradition has roots that run deeper than just Scolti and Van Raalte, two people who led the split. Van Raalte you can go to Holland, Michigan, and learn about old Van Raalte and Scolti. Actually, its faith was not derived from Kuyper, Calvin, or Augustine. All of these are links to the chain that God has forged. But those who wish to penetrate into the deep resources of our heritage must travel even further to Paul and Matthew and the tents of Abraham. The road by which we have received our heritage is not unimportant, but it is more important to possess the goods that have come along the arduous way. That's how he signed his AK for Andrew Kuyvenhoven. So the hope was on that Reformed distinctives and, well, how much are they interwoven with it? Now, in this culture, in this particular this particular context, part of how this is brewing is between the young, energetic, restless, and Reformed who are neo-Puritan, who are basically looking to say the Christian Reformed Church is defined by its confessional distinctiveness. Others will say, no, it's our organic unity. And of course, you will find some fight over the Dutchness of it. But as I've pointed out, this article, Turning Ally into the Christian Reformed Church, a meeting in November 13, 2018 of All One Body, a group that has promoted LGBT inclusion, talked about the judicial strategy. How on earth will we turn away our own youth? Panel members recognized that the legislative approach of sending an overture to synod was not likely to turn the CRC into an inclusive ally of the LGBTQ plus promoters. They also exhibited pessimism that the 2021 synodical report on human sexuality will move the CRC closer to their desired outcome. Quite the contrary, of course. That synodical report was mandated in 2016. Because of this, the panel revealed their preference for a strategy for using the judicial ruling similar to the way that the secular activists won their case at the United Supreme Court with Obergefell. All One Body's plan to transform the CRC will proceed as follows. They will identify a current CRC pastor who is sympathetic to their cause, who is willing to perform a homosexual wedding ceremony, or taking another route, they will find a CRC congregation that is willing to elect an elder or deacon who is openly and proudly living in homosexual partnership. Inevitably, this will cause a firestorm of protest in the CRC. Complaints will be filed. Debate will ensue. The banner will publish articles both for and against. The great brouhaha will eventually make its way to Synod, and the hope that on the part of All One Body is that synodical delegates will embrace the path of least resistance and rule in favor of the pastor of the church or the office bearers, or at least not discipline. And that really banks on not sort of the confessional definition of the church, but the organic definition of the church. These are our children. These are our covenant bearers. To discipline these people out of the church would be to break the covenant. And in fact, just this morning, Ryan Struck wrote an article. Ryan Struck, well, I'll just read some of the article. Less than 72 hours after I came out, an office bearer in the Christian Reformed Church standing in the lobby after worship compared me to a child rapist. A friend compared a recent date to murder and wasn't spoken to me again. Days before my 30th birthday, a family member reached out unsolicited to tell me to end my relationship. A former teacher abruptly messaged me years after graduation to accuse me of attacking the church because I'm gay. A church member messaged me on Facebook out of the blue to urge me to pursue conversion therapy. I've experienced depression on and off for the last decade, and as recently as this year. The Christian Reformed Church is my home. My dad is a CRCNA pastor. Several of my closest friends and mentors are ordained in this denomination. I launched my journalism career at the Banner. I earned my bachelor's degree at Calvin University, the denominationally owned college, and I won the the school's Young Alumni Award in 2021. Now, I wouldn't be allowed to teach there, and I might never sit on its board. Last summer, the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church elevated its opposition to same-sex marriage to confessional status, meaning all pastors, elders, deacons, and even members must agree with it. That's a debatable point. And in fact, it's somewhat of that point is going to come to this synod. This week, Synod 2023 will consider whether to reverse the course or tighten the screws. I don't think there will be a course reversal. As I've said in previous videos, the demographic of the Christian Reformed Church has been changing, and the two demographics that are growing are older and young and Reformed, and Calvin and Grand Rapids is sort of out of step. In many ways, this banner article and what had happened proved prophetic. The difficulty is that once all of those other 3P cohesive elements are reduced and the numbers decline, around what do you engage your identity? Identity is always about difference. What is the difference between someone who's Christian Reformed and not Christian Reformed? Ironically, the movement in 1980 and after the Second World War was, well, we should become part of the mainstream. Okay, but then what is the Christian Reformed Church? Well, it's people who grew up into it. The irony is that what has happened is that those who are left, so you think about these two strands, the confessional strand and the familial strand. The familial strand wanted to reach out, but can you actually enfold these people and into what? Kuyvenhoven talked about Reformed distinctiveness, but didn't really spell out what that distinctiveness would be. Really, what's happening at this synod is to try to figure this out. Part of what's interesting, again, at this is that in many ways, this strategy of diversity favors the confessional side because, as I've noted before, many of those who have come into the Christian Reformed Church from Korean immigrants, from Hispanic immigrants, from African Americans tend to be more conservative when it comes to human sexuality. And the group that tends to be more progressive or affirming tends to be whiter. Now, I think a big part of this is because, again, if you go back to even the exodus that happened after the Second World War, the Christian Reformed Church has been leaking members. They've been maybe maintaining some of their Dutch roots, but for the most part just entering into the American and the Canadian mainstream. I think part of the reason why this plays out a little bit differently in the Canadian churches is, again, the difference in timing. But this identity business, this is why, again, the Christian Reformed Church has as likely in some ways been getting increasingly confessional. But Kuyvenhoven's point is actually true too. The point that he makes towards the end of the article, that especially in isolated pockets of the church where people think their theology and culture are very Dutch, they are unlike anything the old country ever produced. That's because in many ways they assimilated with some Presbyterian and Reformed elements in North America. And that had been happening for a long time. If you look at the group that helped found Westminster and Philadelphia, you'll find a variety of Dutch names. Roger Greenway, who taught missions at Calvin Seminary when I was there, previously had been teaching at Westminster, Philadelphia. Tim Keller is a product of Gordon Conwell and then Westminster, Philadelphia. He had been teaching there until he took the call to do church planting in New York City. And so these two tensions are in very many ways going to be what is at play at Synod 2023, and it is replete with ironies. So keep an eye out this week. You can watch it on the YouTube channel of the Christian Reformed Church. I'll probably be giving regular updates on what I notice as Synod proceeds because I will be watching it too. And so I will leave a comment. Let me know what you think.